Hello and welcome to We Read This. Today's going to be a new kind of episode. I've been brainstorming recently ways to make the podcast a bit more regular. The reason it's not regular is partly because we're not very organised, and partly because the episodes that I do on my own, which are the episodes on Shakespeare or recently the episodes on metamorphosis-related books, take a lot of work. There's a lot of reading, obviously, note-taking, and then compiling and writing the scripts. Those are all scripted. And I wasn't sure at first whether to keep them scripted. The first few definitely sounded quite stiff because I was reading off a page. Even though they sound scripted, I think it's better to have them that way. I'd rather know that I was getting the information I wanted to get in there across than pick a book that means a lot to me that I want to talk about and then just turn the mic on and ramble for an hour, because I think that would just basically waste your time and test your patience. So I want to keep doing those, but realistically, I can't do one of those a week or one of those a fortnight even, not whilst trying to have a life as outside of content. So I've been trying to come up with ways of doing something that takes a little bit less work up front. And so I hit on the idea of talking about something short, poem, short story, articles. Come across so much good criticism in preparing for this podcast that there's plenty of articles that I'd love to talk about in their own right. So taking something short and then making, instead of a 30 or 40 minute script, just a side of notes and talking about it off the cuff, but hopefully still in some depth. So we'll see how it goes. Anyway, the one possible advantage is that it might make the podcast a bit more interactive with those of you listening. We'd like in the past to have said, give us some book ideas that you want us to talk about, but realistically, it was never going to happen. We have to plan so far in advance that we know what we're going to be talking about in a few months' time. So even if you write in suggesting a book that either I love or both Adam and I love and think, oh yeah, great, let's talk about that, it would be months until it came up, so it's just not feasible, really. However, doing something like this, something shorter where my prep time has been, a couple of hours writing up some notes and then recording, it is feasible. And if you write in saying you'd like to hear an episode on a certain poem, certain short story, or anything like that, please do. Good time to mention Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, earreadthis@gmail.com if you want to send any suggestions like that. Go for it. So it might feel strange. It already seems a little bit strange to not be reading. I'm just, I've got a page of notes, and I feel like I'm going to be erring a lot. I apologise. I'm going to try and keep a check on it. Perhaps, though, it's fitting that the poem I've picked is called, apologies for pronunciation, De puero balbutiente, by Thomas Bastard. Now, it's not in Latin, the poem itself, but the title is. It means the stammering child, or the stuttering child. Seems fitting for a first run-up at an off-the-cuff-ish podcast. Now, the reason I picked it, those of you who listened to the Foul Papers episodes and have heard the Keeping Up with the Goodreads challenge, where Adam and I pretty much pick a stupid word and see what comes up on Goodreads and what book titles it features in. You might think that I've chosen this purely by putting the word bastard into some index of poets or poetry, but it's actually not true. I've been reading a great book that I've been looking out for ages recently called The Force of Poetry by Christopher Ricks. And I think it's out of print, but I found it in a secondhand bookshop recently. And it's been one of the best books I've read this summer. But it also made me look up or dig out my old copy of the Oxford Book of English Verse, which is edited by Christopher Ricks, and have a little skim through that. And as I did so, I found this poem, Del puero balbutiente, I don't know, someone will be able to correct me, by Thomas Bastard. Obviously, the name jumped out, but also did his dates. He was born in 1566, and he died in 1618. This makes him almost exactly a contemporary of Shakespeare's. He was born 2 years after Shakespeare and died 2 years after Shakespeare died. I didn't know anything about Thomas Bastard beforehand, so I've looked up. There's some pretty bare-bones facts available. He was a epigrammist. He published a book of hundreds of epigrams, this poem included, and he was a reverend. And he ran into some bother when he published a admonition of other Oxford clergymen for sexual misdeeds, and he was then expelled and ended up dying in a debtor's prison. So quite a colourful biography. 7 or so years after he was expelled, he published his book of epigrams, and now seems a good moment to read the poem out. If you want to either read along or just be able to check the poem as I go on to talk about it, I'm going to post it on Instagram and Facebook before this goes up, so it should be there now. One advantage of this shorter format is I should be able to read things, rights providing, out in full and give you the full text. Obviously, with more recent poems, there's a few tricky issues, but I don't think the bastard estate is going to come after me for reading out this. Okay, so here it is, De puero balbutiente, or the stuttering child. Methinks 'tis pretty sport to hear a child rocking a word in mouth yet undefiled. The tender racket rudely plays the sound, which weakly banded cannot back rebound. And the soft air the softer roof does kiss, with a sweet dying and a pretty miss, which hears no answer yet from the white rank of teeth not risen from their coral bank. The alphabet is searched for letters soft, to try a word before it can be wrought, and when it slides forth it goes as nice as when a man does walk upon the ice. So the gist of the poem seems to be we have an adult narrator commenting on how moving or touching it is, or affecting it is, to hear a child first try out language. And it ends suggesting that when they do get the hang of it, it will signal an end of innocence. It's a 12-line poem made up of 6 couplets, rhyming couplets with the notable exception of one, 10 syllables in a line, and the first line is in typical iambic pentameter, the meter that's most associated with Shakespeare. What interests me about this poem is the techniques Bastard uses to tell his story, the most obvious being rhyme. If you look down the end words of each line, you have child, undefiled, sound, rebound, kiss, miss, rank, bank, soft, wrought, and then nice, ice, return to rhyme at the end. Obviously what sticks out is that soft, wrought. The alphabet is searched for letters soft to try a word before it can be wrought. The rest of the poem has trained us to expect coughed or aloft or croft or something like that, but instead we get wrought, which rather fittingly clangs. Given that the line is all about the child testing out words, or maybe even letters, but not being able quite to wrought them, wrought as in to work, as in play right. Wrought almost lands like a punchline. It almost sounds like a child testing something out and getting it clangingly wrong. Also, the word wrought itself sounds on the ear like something torn or raw. You think of iron being wrought. It's sort of set, unshakable. And in this case, it's a unshakable clanging error. The words are also diametrically opposed, soft and wrought. Another technique that the poem has throughout. We have tender racket, sweet dying, pretty miss. All of these diametrically opposed words that are put together, that are preparing us for that last couplet. And when it slides forth, it goes as nice as when a man does walk upon the ice, i.e. not nice at all, but trippingly, cautiously, and at great peril. It's also nice, that image at the end of a man going upon the ice. I imagine him slipping over, and it seems to be a parallel of a foal trying to take its first steps. But here it's a human child trying to speak its first words. And the return to the rhyme at the end of the poem also helps to tell the story. Even though we know that walking upon the ice isn't guaranteed to be nice, the very fact that the rhyme is there implies some kind of order, or suggests that even if he slips over a few times, he's probably going to make it to the other side. In fact, even before we get to the nice ice rhyme, after the line to try a word before it can be wrought, it's only until halfway through the next line that we get another rhyme. And when it slides forth, even though this makes an alteration to the rhythm, the fact that it sounds nicely against wrought makes it seem like we're being helped back to our feet by bastard. Elsewhere, there are the nice little rhyme touches. The word rebound, when it rhymes with sound, performs its own definition. There's also a slightly uneasy effect, perhaps unintentional, but by rhyming child with undefiled. And on that note, it's slightly uncertain at first in that line whether rocking a word in mouth yet undefiled, whether the undefiled part is referring to the mouth or the word. It seems for the sense of the rest of the poem that it has to be the word, although I have to confess, with it being a reverend and one called bastard, no less, I did think of other connotations that might arise between child's mouths and the word defiled. But remember, he was a bastard in name only. In fact, called out the clergy, although whether it was anything to do with that or just some other sexual misdeeds, it is unclear. So that's rhyme. I want to talk now about metre. I mean, this is another advantage of this shorter format. I've thought several times doing a Shakespeare episode, it'd be great just to slow down and do, 20 minutes on a great speech, talk about metre a bit more. I think I touched on it a bit in the Midsummer Night's Dream, but not enough. So the way in which the rhythm starts in this poem is classically Shakespearean. It's in iambic pentameter, the metre most associated with Shakespeare. Methinks 'tis pretty sport to hear a child. That's classic, 10 syllables in iambic pentameter. So just as a recap then, the iambic part refers to the foot of the line. The foot is a measure of syllables that will be repeated a number of times. In pentameter, it will be repeated 5 times. So iambic pentameter is 5 sets of 2 syllables. Iambic doesn't just mean 2, though. It means a unstressed syllable followed by a stressed one, or if you like, a short syllable followed by a long syllable. One short, one long. Short being unstressed, long being stressed. So like the word baguette, emphasis is on, the stress is on the second syllable. Methinks 'tis pretty sport to hear a child. That's pedantic iambic pentameter, but you get my drift. So the expectation is that the poem will continue that way, but immediately, as soon as we get to the first word of the second line, we have rocking a word in mouth yet undefiled. Okay, so it ends with a bit more of a return to iambic pentameter, but that word rocking does a number of interesting things. First of all, it comes right on the heel of the word child, and so the associations in our heads are with cradles, perhaps a child in arms being rocked to sleep. But no, the meaning of the line is a child rocking a word around its mouth. And the second interesting thing it does is, again, performs the definition of the word. Methinks 'tis pretty sport to hear a child rocking a word in mouth yet undefiled. In order to make the line sound good, you have to put the stress on the very first syllable. It's not going to be to hear a child rocking a word in mouth yet undefiled. That sounds horrible. So you have to put the emphasis on rock, even though it goes against the pattern of the first line. So rocking helps to actually rock the line. Incidentally, so that little 2-syllable unit with a stress on the first syllable and a soft or unstressed or short syllable on the second is called a trochee. Just like iamb, but the other way round. So unlike baguette, it's more like bagel. We go straight back into iambic pentameter for the next 2 lines. The tender racket rudely plays the sound, which weakly banded cannot back rebound. And then we get to this middle section, and the rhythm changes. It sticks just about to 10 syllables. I think there's 1 line with 9, but it's not all in iambic pentameter. It changes quite a lot, actually. This is the section which I think you get a sense of the meaning reading through the poem straight away. It doesn't seem too complicated. It seems to make a kind of poetic sense. But when you try to start actually defining what is being said line by line, it starts to get a bit messy. I'll show you what I mean. So rocking a word in mouth yet undefiled, that's simple enough, even though we can ask whether or not the undefiled bit refers to word or mouth. But then you get to the tender racket rudely plays the sound, which weakly banded cannot back rebound. At first, we've just got a sense of noise. We've got racket. The tender racket might be the sweet attempts of the child. But how can a sound play itself? The tender racket rudely plays the sound. We get the meaning, but it's a bit tangled. It's a bit tautologous. conceiving of the line meaning that. When you go further, the next 3 or 4 are a real mess. So this took me a bit of looking at until I realised that it makes a lot more sense if you think of racket in the sense of a tennis racket, which seems strange at first, and maybe tennis historians or tennis buffs will know this, but it was a surprise to me when first reading Henry V, or I think there's some tennis balls in Romeo and Juliet as well. I can't remember off the top of my head. But tennis was around. Tennis was played by Henry VIII. It was actually around a lot longer than that. There's a reference in about 1400 by John Gower in a poem directed to Henry IV. So it was around. So it's not unfeasible that Thomas Bastard would use a tennis metaphor in this poem. And so the word racket will have been in its tennis shoes by 1598, which is when this poem first emerged, or was first published, rather. It's just a theory, and I might be wrong, but to me, this is how the sense of the poem works if you don't have a tennis racket in your mind for that line, the tender racket rudely plays the sound. Or that line, as we've said, is the sound roughly sounds itself, which weakly banded cannot back rebound. I mean, this is one of the most confusing ones, which uttered weakly cannot find an answer. Is that an answer in itself? Is that like an echo, a child hearing and understanding a word for the first time, grasping it, but then it still has this strange physics of the noise bouncing off something. And what that something is isn't really clear, although there's a few other references to that later on. And then we have, and the soft air, the softer roof does kiss. Well, if we're still going with racket as in sound, then we have a naive or innocent word that brushes a naive or innocent mouth, or inside of mouth, which is, again, kind of weird and not really necessary. With a sweet dying and a pretty miss makes sense, with a pleasant cadence, a noble failure, attractive failure, which hears no answer yet from the white rank of teeth not risen from their coral bank. This is one of the strangest lines to me, especially without the sense of a tennis racket, which I will get back to, because if that's sound, then the child is waiting for the sound it utters to rebound off its teeth, which, I just can't follow. However, substituting in a tennis racket, we have the tender racket rudely plays the sound. Now, what the racket is meant to be standing in for is up to debate, whether it's the child's ability to phrase words, whether it's the part of the child's mouth, maybe the tongue. But for the purposes of this, let's describe the racket as the child's facility for speech. The tender racket rudely plays the sound. The child's facility crudely renders words, which weakly banded cannot back rebound. Now that's a totally flat line without a tennis racket in. Said poorly, it doesn't bounce off anything. But if it's a tennis racket that's weakly banded, then of course it cannot rebound. Whether banded means just held a bit limply, so the ball, if we take the ball to mean the word, just the object that the child's trying to get its mouth around. If the tennis racket is held weakly, the ball just flops off. There's no rebound. But it could also mean weakly banded as in weakly strung, which reinforces all of these references to softness. In fact, soft is repeated at least 3 times, I think. The softness of the child's sounds, but also mouth is set against the hardness of some of the other words. There's the white rank of teeth, ice, of course, and then the word wrought, which we've already talked about. It seems to make a bit more sense to me if you start thinking of the child unable to utter consonants in particular, or maybe just hard letters. If you think about how a toothless infant talks, they are in sort of warbled vowels rather than harder, plosive consonants. Then we have the soft air, the softer roof does kiss. It's a nightmare of a line without a tennis racket. But with one, it almost seems to me like a ball passing through an unstrung racket, or just, falling limply off a weakly strung one. Maybe not, but with a racket in mind, we at least get a sense of that sort of soft collision, a dead ball. And I think if the racket is the facility or the tongue, it makes even the slightly strange here's no answer yet from the white bank of teeth make a little bit more sense, because if you try and zoom in on the process, of a toothless child talking. You have the air, the initial sound created, but it needs to be finished or rounded off with the tongue connecting to the tooth, which makes me think of the start of Lolita. Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul. Lolita, the tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. Lolita. Or oh ye ah, as this child in our bastard poem might say. Where did we get to then? So, tennis. Yeah, you might not buy the tennis. It is only a theory. It's worth mentioning that the poem starts with the line calling the child's effort, watching the child's effort, rather, a pretty sport, which might be reaching. But I also think further down in the 2 lines, which weakly banded cannot back rebound, and the soft air, the softer roof does kiss. Maybe I'm getting carried away with the tennis idea, but to me that actually does sound like a rally, which weakly banded cannot back rebound, followed by, and the soft air, the softer air does kiss. Softer roof, sorry. To me that sounds like an adult's firm tennis form, followed by a child's weaker imitation. In the first line we have the alliteration, but also the stresses: ban, can, back, bound. And then in the following line we have an expectation of a rhythm that will reach it, but instead we have and the soft air, the softer roof does kiss. Not only are the hits, if you like, in that line fewer and softer, but also less imaginative. Instead of ban, can, back, bound, we just have soft and softer. But they're clearly meant to mimic the same effect of the line that precedes it, which, I don't know, it does sound like a tender racket. I've just remembered that John Gower reference to tennis scoring was I think the first use of the word love. Again, tennis aficionados will probably know this, but those of the uninitiated, love in tennis scoring comes from the French l'œuf, as in an egg. L'œuf, because love means 0, which is just a nice thing to have in mind about this poem about embryonic innocence. Whether or not the tennis stuff holds up, it is a rally of sorts, this poem, because we're going in between the subject of the poem, the child, and the narrator, quite clearly an adult. Inevitably, we're going to think of him as Thomas Bastard himself. So forgetting the tennis stuff, the rhythm and the rhyme scheme passes in between these two. And in fact, those lines I mentioned earlier where the rhythm falls away are, funnily enough, the lines in which Bastard is describing the way in which the child speaks. And the soft air, the softer roof does kiss. That's the first one where the rhythm falls away. We have 2 unstressed syllables, and then 2 stressed ones, soft air. Maybe you'd have air unstressed, but I can't really make it scan that way. Then the following line, with a sweet dying and a pretty miss, is different again. We have to sort of join little bits of a line together. So it's when we're this close, this intimate, this far, well, I mean literally far inside the child's mouth, that the rhythm falls away, and it's almost as if the poet is creating for us a sense of formlessness, a dropping off of controlled rhythm. Is, of course, controlled. He knows exactly what he's doing, as he does when we have this example of enjambement, a line that runs off without a break into another line, which hears no answer yet from the white rank of teeth not risen from their coral bank. The effect of this is to actually make the teeth delayed. It takes a whole line to get to them. It makes it sound like, yes, they are taking their time in rising from their coral bank, which is incidentally a rather lovely way to describe gums. So as I said, the rhythm reinstates itself, for the alphabet is search for letters soft to try a word before it can be wrought. Then we have one more drop-off in the rhythm for, and when it slides forth, it goes as nice as when a man does walk upon the ice. What's nice about that is not only the rhyme we talked about before with the fourth and wrought, that kind of fourth comes halfway through the line that follows wrought, but we also, again, we have a sense of it feeling like what's happened. When it slides forth, comma, we've had a comma in the middle of a line, it feels unsettling. We haven't had that. I mean, we had of teeth earlier, but that felt completed. It was completing another line. Whereas this, who knows where we're sliding forth when we hear that. And then we get tripped up again, of course, by it goes as nice as when a man does walk upon the ice. The other clever thing about that is that just as the rhyme scheme comes back, nice and ice, and just as the rhythm also comes back, the iambic pentameter for as when a man does walk upon the ice, the whole point of the poem seems to come together in that the adult who perhaps has been rallying with this child, perhaps like any adult, he has been saying, grown-up words to a child, speaking to them as if they're an adult and seeing the child's attempts to phrase those back, hit those back. I'm going to persevere with the tennis thing. But to end the poem like that, with prim and proper iambic pentameter and a rhyme, it almost serves as a acknowledgement that what will rob the child of the innocence will be its ability to conjure with form and rhyme, and how all of these slippery surfaces and secret meanings that you can create with things like rhyme. The word nice rhymed with ice in such a way makes us expect something pleasant's going to happen, and then see that it's not. But because it still rhymes, it has that kind of authority. Rhyme is beguiling. That's why so many commercials have rhyme, because we hear an assurance in rhyme, even if it's a stupid brand name being rhymed with a word that is just flattering or noble. We ascribe to that a kind of intelligence. So yeah, that does seem to be Thomas Bastard admitting that he knows that the words now that are softly wrought, they may not rhyme, but they have an innocence that will be lost as soon as the child gains the ability to do things like rhyme the word nice and ice, or maybe have a tennis racket stand in for a tongue, or manipulate a rhythm into rocking a reader off guard. Anyway, I thought that was a lovely poem, and a nice place to start with these. Let me know if you liked it, if you've got any thoughts, if you disagree with me about tennis, etc. And if you'd like to hear any poems or other short works, whether it's a speech or a short story, an article, that kind of thing, you'd like done in this sort of slightly more spontaneous way. It's not totally spontaneous. I did make some notes, but it's not scripted. Not sure what will be next. Probably Cock and Bull. It's been quite a long gestating one, that one on Will Self. I just haven't got around to editing it. If you've liked what you've heard, we have got quite a big back catalogue now of episodes on everyone from Dickens to Shakespeare. We've done Wind in the Willows, Kenneth Grahame recently, Philip Roth, Kafka. So if you'd like to support us, please subscribe on iTunes, leave us a review, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and drop us an email at earreadthis@gmail.com. And thanks to Thomas Bastard for providing today's little poem. I hope this tender racket hasn't too rudely played the sound. See you next time. Happy reading. Thank you.